Hi everyone, my name's Sean MacIntyre and today I'm going to give a quick presentation on the Greenisland and Carrickfergus Home Guard. Now everybody of course is aware of the Home Guard through Dad's Army, and this piece of work really started about 20 years ago when I interviewed some of the surviving members of the Home Guard at that stage. So this morning I want to run through some of the things that they did in terms of their activities and their training and the structure and some of the membership of the Home Guard itself. So if I could just quickly start the presentation here. The Home Guard was formed in 1940 and really was a very different time. At that point, the war had just started, and to give a bit of context, we say LP Hartley says the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there, and that's very much true. In 1940, the map of Europe looked very, very different. Germany and its allies, the Axis powers, were basically in control all the way from the Arctic Circle, all the way to the Pyrenees and the French border, across North Africa, and over to the east, basically on the border with Russia. The allies, the UK, its allies, France, Belgium, had been defeated in the west, and at this point, Britain really did stand alone. And this is the background to the formation of the Home Guard. Now, through the process, I spoke to a number of the surviving members over a period of about, I suppose, nearly 10 years. And some of them are Fred Galway from the Upper Road, Greenisland, and Brian Watson from Greenisland, Pat Getty from Unity Street in Carrick, and James McCauley, who was living in Whitehead at that point, George Fowles was in Greenisland, and Billy Clifford was living in Carrickfergus. And they all contributed really to some of their stories and some of the activities and training that they did and how they joined the Home Guard. So we just have a look. And again, not only were the times different, but the places were different. So this is Greenisland roughly as it appears today. So to get your bearings, that's the Shore Road. That's the Belfast-Larne Railway line. That would be Farm Lodge. That's Greenisland Estate. And it's quite a medium-sized town now. If you look back then, this is how Greenisland appeared. It was essentially a station road and a few houses off it. There's, for instance, Walletmore Park, and there's the Upper Road, and again the Shore Road. And it's a similar picture with Carrickfergus. Carrickfergus is a much bigger town today than it was. So again, obviously everybody can pick out the castle. This is the old town centre. This is Sunnylands up through Prospect. And this photograph was taken in 1951, and they've just started to build Sunnylands at that point, so it wasn't there pre-war, but you can actually see that Carrickfergus itself was really quite a small town at that point. So how did the Home Guard form? Well, clearly in the spring of 1940 and early summer, the UK were very, very worried about the threat of invasion, and Anthony Eden called for a volunteer force to be formed of people aged between 17 and 65, and it was going to be called the Local Defence Volunteers. At that stage, this call for the creation of what would become the Home Guard didn't extend to Northern Ireland, and James Craig, the Prime Minister, pushed for a similar force to be created. And the impetus really was, as I said, the Allies, the UK and France, had been defeated with the fall of France on the 28th of May, and there was genuine fear that England and possibly Ireland as well would be subject to invasion from the German forces. So in terms of recruitment, this tended to be by word of mouth, and Colonel Henschel, who was in charge of the B Specials at that time, invited locals to come along and meet in the Unionist Hall on Station Road, Greenisland. And I'm assuming that this type of invitation went out across most towns and villages in the province. And he invited those people who were interested there and said, we're talking about forming a Home Guard. It won't be an easy job. You'll be called out when you're not expecting it. You have to attend training and you'll have to do as you're told. And you need to make up your mind that you're going to stay in for a prolonged period, not in 1 week and out the next month. And at that point, about 22 of the locals in Greenisland signed up. And similarly across Carrickfergus, there were another 3 platoons that were formed at this stage. The organisation in Northern Ireland was very different to the UK. In the UK, there was a network of territorial army associations, and it was quite easy to actually attach the Home Guard onto those. There was no similar administrative military structure within Northern Ireland, And it was decided, in my view, really as a matter of expediency to attach the Home Guards to the existing B specials, the Special Constabulary. Now, there were obviously connotations associated with that, but it was probably a pragmatic solution in a very dire time of need. This also left those people who joined the Home Guard in a difficult situation because they were actually combatants but civilians, and because they were joined through essentially a unit of the police, they weren't covered by the Geneva Convention, and in the event of an invasion, they could have been shot as resistant fighters by the German forces. And this matter wasn't really resolved until the passing of the Defence Ulster Home Guard regulations in 1942, and that required the volunteers to serve under military control, stating that they were part of the army. This map's actually available from the Public Record Office, and you can see the way that the platoons were spread across Northern Ireland, and you can see from Carrickfergus here, you've got the Carrickfergus, you've got Greenisland, you've got Marshallstown, and they were basically just set up in their own neighbourhoods. So, in terms of the Ulster Home Guard command structure, the Carrickfergus Company was started part of the 3rd Antrim Battalion. And there was the number 1 Carrickfergus platoon, the number 2 Woodburn, number 3 Marshallstown, and number 4 Greenisland. And these are just some of the commanders. So for overall command of the battalion, you had Lieutenant Colonel Jack McFerrin, who lived out in the house where Carrick Hospital was and the health centre is now. Arthur Holmes was the officer in charge of the Carrick Company. And then under the various platoons, you had Tony Henderson, Billy Beggs, Ben Crowe, and Fred Galway for Greenisland. And some of these names are still familiar around Carrick today, the best part of 80 years later. There were also, later in the war, and 4 more platoons created, and I'll discuss the reasons why later. And Harry Hughes, Jack Gorman, I think it's Norman McCourt, I didn't actually find out for definite, and Sammy Sims would lead those particular platoons. The command structure inside each platoon, they numbered roughly 25 to 35 men, and they were broken down into sections. And in this particular case, you can see the sections for the Greenisland platoon. Number 10 was under Sergeant Stanley Barclay, Sergeant Gilmore, Sergeant McGran, and then they would have a platoon lieutenant or sergeant, and they would relate up to platoon HQ. In addition to the local platoons at that time, the LMS, the London Midland Scottish Railway, operated the Belfast-Larne Railway line, and they, at the start of the war, formed their own Home Guard unit. George Fowles, who lived in Greenisland, basically said management put out a call. He took it quite lightly. He said everyone thought it was a bit of a joke, but they all joined in anyway. This railway platoon only seems to have lasted about a year, and at least 5 of it merged into the Greenisland platoon. So you had Brian Watson and George Fowles and John McCurgan, who became part of the Greenisland platoon. But for a time, their main purpose was to, at night, guard the railway stations, guard the main bridges in case of saboteurs or an invasion. The volunteers themselves, this is Andrew Terry, who was the first person in charge of the Greenisland platoon, and he was quite methodical in terms of recording the details of the men who joined. So you can see that this is the 9th of July 1940. The person lived in Upper Road. They were a foreman. They were aged 35. It gave their height, they're married, whether they owned a bicycle, etc. And they were actually, it gives on enlisting, they all were given a rifle, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The age, we are all sort of conditioned by Dad's Army to think that the volunteers were all old men, and that may have been more of the case certainly in GB, where there was conscription. There was no conscription of the forces here, and also a lot of the men here worked in reserve occupations in the shipyard and in shorts and on the railways, and were not available for military service. And when you look at the age structure, it is not the case of them all being Joneses or Godfreys. in this particular case, most of them are actually Pikes and Wilsons, because you see that the most frequent age group is between 26 and 35, and there's only a small number actually aged over 40. So it was predominantly young men or men in their prime, and not the vision that we have through Dad's Army. And the occupations were a real range: solicitors, bank managers, managers of the railways, fitters, mechanics, shop assistants, labourers, the unemployed. And the leaders in the unit appear to have emerged to take command by peer selection, irrespective of the background. And it wasn't just the case that as in Dad's Army, the captain had that position because he was a bank manager. The leaders seemed to emerge through the selection of the men, although true to the stereotype, Arthur Holmes, actually, who was the officer in charge of the Carrickfergus company, was a bank manager. Now, I worked this out from the attendance record of the Home Guard volunteers, and you can see at formation in July 1940, they were really worried. They met 19 times that month, and you can just see the sort of the fear of invasion. But even throughout the war, they were still meeting, 5-6 times a month for that 4-year period. And Brian Watson really summed it up for me. Brian lived in the Upper Road. He said it was a terrible time. It nearly killed me. Out all night to 4 or 5 in the morning, and then I had to go to work. So these men really did commit to this service. And again, at the start of the war in Great Britain, the Home Guard had no uniforms, and they trained with brush shafts. The situation was slightly different here, because once you enlisted, you basically got a Lee Enfield 303 and 100 rounds of ammunition, and they were to be kept by the volunteers on their home, and this was regarded as a strong recruiting factor. The rifles, as John Tyler recalled, actually were the UVF weapons brought over in the Clyde Valley that had been held in store and were used, obviously, at the outbreak of the Second World War, and distributed for the Home Guard. That was really at the start of the war. As the war progressed, their weapons actually became more standard military fare. Brian Watson, I think it actually said at the end of the war, he had a Sten gun in the house, and that's a typical British Army weapon of the Second World War. The uniform, and again, it started out, it was really a set of black overalls, which were generally disparaged by all who wore them. The story goes they were originally meant to be khaki in color, but there was a mistake in the dyeing process, and they ended up with these black overalls. And this is a picture of George Fowles with his brother Edmund Miller taken in Glen Island Terrace in Green Island, and George is wearing the black uniform. Eventually, this was replaced by the standard British battle dress of World War II, and you can see the insignia here, and this is actually for anti-aircraft gunnery that I'll talk about. So you can see actually between the formation of the Home Guard, it was a force in terms of its composition, its administrative structures, even its uniform was quite different to that on GB. But by the time you get to 1942 and to the last end of the wars in 1944, it was essentially equivalent to a part-time regular army force, and was similarly structured to the rest of those units within the UK. Training in Green Island, training actually was in the Unionist hut on the station road, no longer there. This is a photograph taken in 1945 of a wedding, and they went to this wooden hut and they did rifle training. They also had weekend camps, and this is actually a list of the meals that they were provided for camp. And you have to bear in mind that there was rationing at that particular time. So being fed for a weekend was a bonus, because you weren't using your ration cards for the food. They also did various exercises with, for instance, the US Rangers, and Billy Clifford described defending the bridge at Barn Halt, and with the US Rangers coming alongside. And Billy was quite frustrated in this tale about this, because it was classic Dad's Army stuff. They were rattling a tin to replicate the noise of a machine gun, and picking up sods of clay to lob at each other, which were supposed to be grenades. And he said, anyway, I was lying by the side of the bridge, and one Yank came right up, about 3-inch rifle. I went click and said, you're a dead Yank. And of course, the Yank wasn't having on it and said, you missed me, boy, and ran off. So there was obvious frustration in some of the training. They also, at various stages, had set pieces against both the regulars and, in some cases, commandos who were training in the glens. And for instance, the objective of the commandos was to occupy Carrick Castle. And in one particular occasion, the entire company, which at that stage was 4 platoons, had the objective of defending the town from the regulars. The umpire for this particular exercise was General Carton de Weert, and he has a really quite a rich history in terms of military service in the First and Second World Wars. And he was acting as umpire, and that places this particular training exercise in the first 6 months of either the last 6 months of 1940 or the first quarter of 1941, because that's when he was stationed in the province. Anyway, the commandos were to attack using brain carriers that some of you may be familiar with, and to simulate grenades, they had sweetie bags with whiting, with sand thrown in to give them a bit of weight. And of course, the brain carriers were coming down the North Road, and then the men were stationed on all the approaches to the town and were pelting the brain carriers with sweetie bags of sand. And by good luck, actually managed to get some of the sweetie bags of sand into the driver's eyes and half blinded the man, and he ended up crashing the brain carrier in the shuck by the side of the road. So there are definite elements of sort of comedic elements of Dad's Army in some of the tales. They also had to stand guard out at Fort Road, because at that point, at that time, there were gun emplacements, and you can see them here. They're the equivalent of the guns that are still in position at Gray's Point in Bangor. And this is the entire military camp you can see here. And they used to go down and do weekend camps, and to relieve the guys who were serving here at Fort Road, so they could go and have some rest and recreation. The guys weren't very keen on it, because they used to be stationed up by the graveyard, and it is quite an eerie place for those of you who've been there. One thing I asked all of the gentlemen that I interviewed about was actually what they were doing on the nights of the Blitz in April 1941, April, May, and 41. And they really had quite vivid memories, because the raids caused extensive damage, casualties estimated from 700 to 900 in a particular night. And I wanted to put this perspective in terms of what they saw. So, for instance, James Macaulay recalled he lived at the top of Knock at that point, and he was looking over at the entire Belfast Lough, and he said he would have thought the whole of Belfast was in flames. And down below him in Greenisland, the rest of the Home Guard unit, they were keeping the roads clear, and the noise of the bombs was dreadful. They obviously thought that this was a prelude to an invasion. So you got the noise of the bombs echoing off Knocka as well. And Fred Galway said that after about 15 minutes, when the bombs started falling, all these cars started to stream out from Belfast, and they actually got them to park in where the War Memorial Sports Club is now, on that ground there. He said they couldn't see the bombers, but they could see the tracks of the incendiary bombs being dropped further down towards the Lough and in the Hollywood Hills as well. And he reckoned that they were using Knocka Monument as well as one of the markers to actually steer the planes in for the bombing raids. My own father, who was 14 at the time, recalls standing at the back lane at the back of Mullaghmore Park and watching Belfast burn. And my grandfather was stationed in Belfast as a policeman, and that's a piece of a German parachute mine that he picked up in the aftermath of the raid. Brian Watson worked in the railway, and he decided that they would try and get into York Road where he was based. He said it was chaos. Everyone you saw, their faces were black. There were pieces of burning wood and smoke in the air. And when he got to York Road, everything was alight. There were 270 good wagons burning, and they had been full of eggs and potatoes, and the heat of the fire had sort of roasted the potatoes and the eggs. And he said the army boys came in and polished them off, but it was total chaos. He described people running in blind terror, actually running into the car as he drove in because the line had been cut at White House, and they couldn't get the train in. James Houston, who lived at the bottom of Greenisland Station Road, was struck by the noise, and the dogs were running terrified and howling along the roads. And then he also encountered people fleeing from Belfast, and they were trying to get up onto the Knocker, out into the countryside. And this was quite a common phenomenon after the Blitz, for these people who every night went out to the countryside to sleep and became known as ditchers, actually. So they all had a very vivid memory of the Blitz. There were also some other occasions. So there was a real fear, especially in the early parts of the war, of a German invasion. And after the Blitz, this increased, and there was a perception that there could have been fifth colonists in the community. And on various occasions, there were scares of lights and signals coming from Knocker, and the local Home Guard were sent out to investigate these. And I've detailed more of these stories in the book that's been produced to accompany this talk. So I'll not go into further detail, but there are quite some entertaining tales that they encountered on their trips up Knocker. After about 1942, the immediate threat of invasion receded, and in order to keep the Home Guard fully occupied, they decided that they would get them to man the anti-aircraft guns. And there were a number of reasons for this. There was to release the regular army and personnel from duty, and actually to encourage the retention of the Home Guard volunteers. And they were all issued with these anti-aircraft ID. And the particular battery that the Greenisland and indeed the entire Carrickfergus company occupied was in the grounds of what's Belfast High School. So for those of you, this is the Shore Road here, before the widening scheme took place. This is the high school buildings, this is the Ulster University, and this is what was the all-weather pitch. And this is what it looked like during the war. And these are actually anti-aircraft batteries here at Neil's Lane. So they drove up off Neil's Lane. There was an army camp. This was, as was known as the command post. And parts of that were still there until the 1970s when I was in Belfast. I actually remember the diggers moving in and demolishing the last bits of the command post. And I'm assuming that some of these anti-aircraft battery details are actually buried under the all-weather pitch because it's slightly raised. So there was also training, and this is seamount out towards the Blahole, towards Whitehead, and you can see the remains on the ground here. This is the same shot, and again taken in the early 50s. This is the army camp, and this is where the anti-aircraft batteries were situated there. Although the Carrick company didn't seem to have served on these batteries, although they did use them for training. So what did they do? Each platoon manned the guns one night in 8, and that's why the additional 4 platoons were created in the Carrick company. The volunteers were dropped off at Neil's Lane about 6 in the evening and picked up at 5 the next morning, and the regular army manned the guns during the day. And this really went on for the best part of 2 years, but it ended very abruptly in October 1944. As well as manning the guns, there seemed to be quite a bit of entertainment there, and there's a couple of pictures of parties that were held at Neil's Lane camp. So for instance, that's Jim McCurgan there, Albert Shaw, that's Arthur Holmes, you can see standing there. So if there was nothing on that particular evening, or there was some entertainment for the men to enjoy. They also seemed to indulge in a number of parades. So this is obviously High Street Carrick, and this one was dated in May 1944. So they're walking past. You can't see who the officers are receiving the salute, but that's Fred Galway at the front there. I think that's Jonathan Sims walking along there, and you can pick out some of the other men in the parade, and that's the entire Carrick company walking past of the Home Guard. And again, another parade in Greenisland Station Road, and that one's being led by Jack Gorman, and that looks to be Jack McFerrin taking the salute. And this is the officers and NCOs of the Carrickfergus and the 3rd Antrim Battalion. And they used to meet and train at Scoutbush House, which was at Troopers Lane. It was demolished in the 1970s. And indeed, a number of the volunteers seem to have actually gone down there to have enlisted in the Home Guard as well. So you've got Jack McFerrin in the front, there's Fred Galway, Arthur Holmes, and a lot of these gentlemen I haven't actually been able to identify. So if anybody can put some names to them, that would be very useful. That's Ben Crow there. So the end and stand down, the Home Guard actually was closed down at the end of December 1944, because at that stage, although the war wasn't over, it was quite clear that the Allies were going to be victorious. And the men all received a certificate and a thank you letter, and this was the actual stand down parade. This is in Laharna, outside of Laharna in Larne, and the entire East 3rd Battalion went down and did a parade there. There also, of course, the war dragged on until May 1945, and this is a celebratory bonfire which was on the Upper Road in Greenisland. Some of these people still live there. So Robin Cameron and Greg Buchanan, who are in the photograph, still live in the Upper Road. They're all in their 80s now, of course. So sort of overall, how did the Ulster Home Guard perform? Bearing in mind that they were volunteers and were unpaid, it seemed to have developed into a competent force. When pitched against regular troops in exercises, the Home Guard performed quite well on their home turf. And anti-aircraft gunnery, they beat the regulars to their call-out positions, and on occasions actually had the good luck to shoot drogues from their towing aircraft, which they weren't meant to do, but did. They had a number of marksmen, and what they lacked in military skill and discipline, they made up for in spirit and camaraderie. Not bad for unpaid volunteers with families and full-time jobs. Now, I entitled this lecture Forgotten Service, and thankfully it mostly is, because as history played out, there was no German invasion of the UK or Ireland. But that's not to say that it was totally improbable. And in fact, there were a number of assault plans actually developed in 1941. And one in particular by General Student, who actually led the successful invasion of Crete with paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, anticipated a landing of 20,000 men in a triangle basically between West Belfast, Divis, and Antrim. And they thought that they had a better measure of success in doing this than a similar landing in the UK. And the objective was to secure this area and then move on and secure the rest of the province. Of course, it didn't happen, but it's not beyond possibility that it could have done. Thankfully, that wasn't to be the case. So the Ulster Home Guard did its 4-year service and thankfully wasn't called to defend the country. However, there seems to have been a degree of camaraderie about the whole thing, and as a body of men, they continued to meet annually well into the 1950s, if not the early 60s, for annual dinners, and this is an example of one of the ones in 1950. And then there was a final reunion at the 50th anniversary of the Home Guard in 1990, and that was up at the Knocker Lodge. The event was well attended. Unfortunately, nobody was there to record some of the experiences of these men at that particular time. And subsequent to that, I've produced this book. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the service of the Home Guard in Greenisland and Carrickfergus, there's a lot more details given in this book. And you can get a copy from the Historical Society. There's an email address here, or you can phone this number here. And hopefully you'll want to find out a little bit more of the forgotten service of the men of the Greenisland and Carrickfergus Home Guard. Thank you very much, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this talk.